I've been a truck driver for 13 years, traveling the roads of the United States from end to end. My name is Frank Morrison. I'm 43 years old, and I had never experienced anything so inexplicable until that night in January 2023. I was taking my usual route from Montana to Washington, transporting a load of agricultural equipment. Winter in that region is always brutal, but on that particular night, man, it was as if nature itself had decided to test us. The temperature had plummeted to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and the blizzard that was falling was the thickest I had ever seen in my entire life on the road. My old red Peterbilt 389, which I named Betty, was holding strong, but I confess I was more tense than usual. I had already lost count of how many coffees I had had at the last stop at Miller's, just to maintain my concentration in that almost zero visibility. That's when I saw the taillights of two trucks just ahead, on Interstate 90, near the Idaho border. I slowed down a little and picked up the radio to make contact. I always did this. It was basic safety protocol among us truck drivers. On the other end of the frequency, I heard the friendly, husky voice of a guy who introduced himself as Pete, driving a navy blue Freightliner. Soon after, a younger voice identified himself as Marcus, in command of a white Kenworth. The third truck, a black Western Star, was driven by a guy named Ray with a thick Texas accent that made me smile. We agreed to form a small convoy, something common in extreme weather conditions like that. Pete took the lead as he knew the region well, Marcus was in the middle, Ray was third, and I closed the line. That training brought me momentary relief, you know? I had enough experience to know that, on nights like this, unity made all the difference between reaching your destination safely or, well, better not to think about the alternatives. We all tuned in to the same radio frequency and started a relaxed conversation to keep our spirits up during the trip. Pete talked about his granddaughter who had just been born in Minnesota. Marcus talked about plans to get married in the summer in Seattle. And Ray couldn't stop complaining about the cold, typical of a Texan who wasn't used to those temperatures. The conversation flowed naturally as we drove along the snow-covered road, keeping a safe distance from each other. The taillights of the trucks in front of me were like guiding lights in that absurd darkness. And with each kilometer covered, I mentally thanked myself for not being alone on that hellish night. Until, after about 2 hours of driving, I noticed something strange. Ray's voice, which was babbling about his favorite barbecue restaurant in Austin, just stopped in the middle of a sentence. The first thing I thought was that his radio had died. It happens sometimes, especially in this weather, but when I looked ahead, I noticed that the taillights on his black Western Star were also gone. No blinkers, no brakes, nothing. It was as if he had been swallowed by the blizzard. I immediately called on the radio, "Ray? Ray, can you hear me, partner?" Silence. Marcus and Pete also tried to make contact, but nothing. Pete suggested slowing down to give Ray a chance to catch up, in case he had fallen behind for some reason. We slowed down, but I confess that my heart was already beating faster. There was something very wrong happening. I could feel it. That silence on the radio wasn't normal. It was different. It was like there was a weight, you know? A weight that became increasingly suffocating as the minutes passed. 20 minutes passed, and there was no sign of Ray. The tension was palpable in Pete and Marcus' voices on the radio, trying to stay calm as we discussed what to do. That's when Marcus let out a frightened exclamation. "Guys, there's something wrong with my dashboard. All the instruments are. They are." His voice cracked, and before he could finish his sentence, I saw the white Kenworth's lights begin to blink frantically, as if it were having a short circuit. It was a surreal scene. Lights flickered in a chaotic pattern, illuminating the falling snow in disturbing flashes. "Marcus, Marcus, talk to me," I shouted into the radio. The last sound I heard from him was a high-pitched, distorted hiss, followed by a silence even more frightening than the last. And then, like what happened with Ray, the lights on his truck just disappeared. At that moment, I felt a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Pete was shouting into the radio, his normally calm voice now choked with panic. "What the hell is going on?" he kept repeating, as I kept my eyes fixed on the only lights I could still see in the storm, those on his navy blue Freightliner. We tried to find some rational explanation. Maybe they had to stop due to some mechanical problem, but there was no visible shoulder on that part of the road, and even if there had been, we would have seen the emergency lights, right? Besides, what problem could cause two different trucks to just disappear like that without leaving a trace? Pete suggested that we should stop and go back to look for them, but something told me that stopping on that road would be the worst possible decision. It was a primal instinct, that kind of feeling that makes you want to run even though you don't know exactly what you're running from. It was then that Pete's voice began to crack on the radio. Frank, do you see this?" he asked with a tremor that chilled me to the core. "See what, Pete?" I replied, feeling my heart almost falling out of my mouth. There's something on my windows. It feels like..." And then the transmission started to fill with static. Between the hisses, I could hear fragments of his voice, increasingly desperate. "It's everywhere. I can't. The glass it's freezing inside. My controls aren't. Frank." His scream was the last thing I heard before the radio stopped for good. Through the curtain of snow, I saw the lights on Pete's Freightliner begin to flicker, just as Marcus's had done. But this time I swear I saw something else. For a split second, when a flash of lightning cut across the sky, illuminating the entire road, I could see a kind of fog. It wasn't like normal snow or fog. It was denser, almost alive. She seemed to move purposefully around Pete's truck, as if she were enveloping him in a cold, deadly embrace. His lights flickered one last time, brighter than any before, almost blinding me, and then total darkness. The navy blue Freightliner simply ceased to exist in front of me, just like the other two. Now I was all alone on that damn road, with nothing but the sound of my engine and the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. The snow continued to fall mercilessly, and every flake that hit the windshield seemed to mock my situation. For the first time in 13 years on the road, I felt a real, visceral fear of what might lie ahead of me in the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, and my mind was spinning trying to process what had just happened. The stopping point we had agreed on, the Flying J truck stop, was about 30 minutes away. Every second of that trip felt like an eternity. The speedometer didn't go above 40 miles per hour. I didn't dare go any faster, but I also didn't dare go any slower. Betty was snoring faithfully, but even the sound of the engine seemed different, as if she were hesitant. The radio had become a cemetery of static, and no matter how much I tried other frequencies, I only found that disturbing hiss that seemed to carry distant echoes of the last words of my companions on the road. That's when I started to notice changes in my own truck. First, there were small things. The fuel gauge started to oscillate for no reason, even though I knew I had filled the tank at the last stop. Then, the engine temperature started to rise, even with all that cold outside. The air inside the cabin became increasingly cold, even with the heater on full blast. I began to see my own breath forming increasingly dense clouds of vapor. The glasses began to form ice patterns on the inside, just as Pete had described. But it wasn't normal ice. The shapes that formed seemed almost like symbols, designs that made my eyes hurt just looking at them. I took out my cell phone to try to take a photo, but the screen was completely black, even though it had just charged. I was alone, isolated, and increasingly terrified. Panic started to set in when I noticed that same strange fog that I had seen around Pete's truck starting to form around my windshield. It was as if thousands of tiny ice crystals were dancing in the air, but moving against the wind, against any logic or laws of physics. The light from my headlights reflected off them in an unnatural way, creating an effect that looked like an ominous aurora borealis right in front of me. The sound of the engine began to fail, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that every truck driver knows when his companion on the road starts to have problems. Betty was fighting something, and I could feel she was losing the battle. The instruments on the dashboard began to spin wildly, as if possessed, and the lights inside the cabin began to flash in the same chaotic pattern I had seen in the other trucks. No, 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 no! I started screaming, banging on the dashboard as if that would make any difference. I remembered the other three, how they had disappeared without a trace, and the thought that I would be next made my stomach turn. That's when I noticed something even more disturbing. Through the rearview mirror, I could see a kind of glow. It was as if something was approaching from behind the truck, something that gave off a sickly bluish light. It wasn't another vehicle's light. It was something completely different. Every second it grew stronger, closer, and along with it came a sound that shouldn't exist in this world. It was like a buzzing sound mixed with something that sounded like distorted singing, as if someone was singing underwater at a frequency impossible for human vocal cords. My teeth started to hurt just hearing that, and I felt a taste in my mouth, as if I were chewing on aluminum foil. It was at that moment that I made the most difficult and possibly most important decision of my life. Contrary to all my training and experience, I stepped on the gas. Betty initially protested, but responded to the command, and soon we were flying at over 70 miles per hour on a snow-covered road with near-zero visibility. It was suicide, I knew that, but my instinct screamed that staying there, letting that thing reach me, would be much worse than any accident. The buzzing behind me grew louder, more insistent, and in the mirrors I could see that the light was getting closer. The ice inside the cabin started to spread faster, forming those strange symbols everywhere. The steering wheel was so cold it seemed to burn my hands, even through my gloves. The snow in front of me began to move even more strangely, as if it were being sucked into an invisible spot a few feet away. It was like driving into a black hole made of ice and darkness. My heart was beating so hard that I thought I was going to have a heart attack right there. The entire dashboard of the truck was now covered in those ice symbols, and as they formed, they seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. The sound behind me had transformed into something even worse. Now it sounded like there were voices mixed in with the buzzing, voices I recognized with horror. Pete, Marcus, and Ray, all screaming at once, their voices distorted and overlapping in a cacophony that made tears come to my eyes. Involuntary drips down my face. They screamed my name, begged for help, but there was something wrong in their voices, something deeply unnatural that made my hair stand on end. The speedometer needle was shaking violently, reading 85 miles per hour when I finally spotted the lights of the Flying J truck stop through the curtain of snow. I have never felt such relief when I saw that familiar sign shining in the darkness. But then, something even more impossible happened. Time inside the cabin seemed to slow down. My every movement became slower, as if I were moving through syrup. The air became even denser, almost solid, and I felt an unbearable pressure in my ears, as if I were diving into the depths of the ocean. The distorted voices of my missing companions turned into a single, continuous bass tone that made my bones vibrate. The bluish glow behind me was so close that it lit up the entire cabin now, and in the rearview mirror, good heavens, in the rearview mirror I finally saw it. No, I can't describe exactly what I saw in that mirror. My mind simply refuses to fully process that image. It was as if my brain was protecting me, blocking out the most disturbing details of this thing. What I can say is that there were shapes that moved in impossible ways, colors that shouldn't exist in our spectrum of light, and something that seemed to be both solid and liquid at the same time. It was like looking at a puzzle made of nightmares, where each piece twisted and changed every second. And it had eyes. Dozens, maybe hundreds of eyes, all focused on me. But they weren't normal eyes. They were like holes in the very fabric of reality. Each one a window into a void so deep and ancient that my sanity threatened to crumble just by staring at them for a split second. At that moment, I understood perfectly why the others' voices had that tone of utter despair. In a last impulse for survival, I turned the steering wheel with all my might toward the gas station entrance, practically throwing Betty against the curve. The exact moment the wheels touched the asphalt of the Flying J parking lot, it was as if a bubble had burst. Suddenly, all that supernatural weight that was pressing down on the cabin just disappeared. The buzzing stopped, the voices stopped, and the bluish light dissipated like smoke in the wind. The ice symbols on the glasses began to melt instantly, running down the surfaces like frozen tears. The panel returned to normal, and Betty stopped fighting invisible controls. I hit the brakes so hard that the truck skidded a few meters before coming to a complete stop, leaving black marks on the snow-covered asphalt. Sitting there, shaking uncontrollably, I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard. 3:33 a.m. It had only been an hour and a half since I met the train on Interstate 90. It seemed impossible. The whole experience had seemed to take an eternity. With wobbly legs, I got out of the cabin and staggered to the gas station's convenience store. The attendant, a young man with a sleepy face, looked at me worriedly when I entered. I must have looked like a lunatic, drenched in freezing sweat, pale as a ghost. "Hey man, are you cool?" he asked. I did the only thing I could think of. I asked to use the station's phone. I needed to contact the highway police, alert them about the 3 missing trucks. They needed to do something, search, investigate, anything. The police arrived in about 40 minutes. 2 officers, Thompson and Rivera, listened to me with a mixture of skepticism and concern. I reported everything I could remember. The identifications of the trucks, the names of the drivers, the exact sequence of events. They made some calls, checked records, and that's when the story got even more disturbing. There was no record of any trucks matching those descriptions traveling on I-90 that night. In fact, according to the records at the Miller station, where I had stopped earlier, I had been the only truck driver to have passed by in the last 5 hours. Sergeant Thompson suggested that I had imagined it all out of exhaustion and stress from the storm. Rivera was more understanding and asked me to make a detailed report, promising to investigate. But I saw in his eyes that he didn't believe a word I had said. I spent the next few weeks trying to find any information about Pete, Marcus, and Ray. I scoured trucker Facebook groups, online forums, contacted trucking companies. Nothing. It was as if they had never existed. The only hard evidence I have that something actually happened that night are the skid marks in the Flying J parking lot, which are still there, I'm told, and a single photo I managed to take with my cell phone before it died. The photo is completely distorted, practically unrecognizable, except for one detail. When you zoom in on the top right corner, you can clearly see one of the ice symbols that formed on my windshield. A symbol that, according to an ancient linguistics professor I consulted months later, does not resemble any alphabet known to humanity. Today, almost a year later, I still wake up in the middle of the night hearing those distorted voices. And every time I hit the snowy road, I make a point of traveling alone. Because now I know there are worse things than loneliness on icy Montana roads. It's been 3 months since that night on I-95 and I still have trouble sleeping properly. I've been a truck driver for 12 years. I always travel from Boston to Miami transporting various loads, and I've never felt as scared as I did that morning. It was a typical Thursday in October. The weather was freezing and a light drizzle didn't stop falling. I left Massachusetts around 8 p.m. after loading a shipment of electronics that needed to be in Florida within 48 hours. The plan was to drive straight to South Carolina, stopping only for gas and coffee. He was used to long trips, and this seemed like just another normal night on the road. I remember I had just passed through New Haven, Connecticut, when I started to feel something strange. It was subtle at first, that nagging feeling that something was out of place. I noticed that my thermos wasn't exactly where I'd left it in the cup holder, and my jacket, which always hangs behind the seat, was a little crooked. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just tiredness making me imagine things. After all, I had been driving for almost 5 hours, and it wouldn't be the first time that sleep had played tricks on me. I turned on the radio at a low volume to distract myself, tuned to a local station that played country, and remained focused on the dark road in front of me. Traffic was light at that time, just the occasional truck and car passing by. But that strange feeling wouldn't go away. On the contrary, it became stronger and stronger. Every now and then, I could swear I saw something moving in the reflection of the windshield, like a shadow moving behind me. I even thought about stopping at the next gas station to check the cabin, but something told me to keep driving. Then it happened. As I was adjusting the rearview mirror, I distinctly heard the sound of the floorboards creaking behind my seat. It wasn't the normal noise of a moving truck. It was the unmistakable sound of someone changing position. My entire body froze. The blood seemed to run cold in my veins as I tried to process that sound. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and I felt my heart race like a runaway engine. Couldn't be real, I thought to myself. It must just be my head playing tricks. But then I noticed another detail that made my stomach sink. The smell. It was a subtle odor of sweat and dirt that definitely hadn't been there before. A smell of someone who hadn't showered in days. I tried to remain calm and continue driving normally, as if I hadn't noticed anything. My mind was racing frantically, trying to decide what to do. It was in the middle of nowhere, between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, with no checkpoint or rest area in sight. The cell phone was on the stand near the dashboard, but there was no way to call the police without the person behind me noticing. They were the longest minutes of my life. I drove trying to look natural, but all my senses were on high alert. In the rearview mirror, he could only see shadows at the back of the cabin, but now he was absolutely sure he wasn't alone. Every now and then, I heard low, almost imperceptible breathing, mixed with the noise of the engine. I started to break out in a cold sweat. My mind created 1,000 different scenarios about who I could be and what I wanted. Was it a robber? A fugitive? Someone who had come in when I stopped for gas in New Haven? The fear was growing along with the knowledge that I was locked in a cabin at 70 miles per hour with a complete stranger hiding behind me. The worst part was not knowing how long this person had been there, silently watching me as I drove without suspecting anything. The idea that someone had been watching me for hours without me realizing it made me sick. It was then that I saw the lights of a Pilot gas station appearing in the distance. It was my chance. I signaled and started to reduce speed as if I were normally going to stop for gas. My plan was to brake sharply as soon as I entered the station and run out of the cabin. But as I started to slow down, I heard clearer movement behind me and a gruff voice whispered, "Keep driving." I felt something cold and metallic touching the back of my neck. It was a knife or something similar. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold the steering wheel. The stranger spoke again, still whispering, but now with a more threatening tone. "Go straight past the gas station. If you try anything, you won't like it." I swallowed hard and accelerated again. passing straight through the lit post that represented my only chance of help. For the first time in my entire life on the road, I felt completely vulnerable and powerless. The next 2 hours were a real nightmare. The man, I was now sure it was a man from the voice, continued behind me, occasionally giving me short instructions on which direction to go. He had me get off I-95 and onto some back roads I didn't know. It was taking me further and further inland, along deserted roads surrounded only by dark fields and trees. The cold object was still pressed against the back of my neck, and I could smell it getting stronger as he leaned forward every now and then to check where we were. I tried to memorize every detail of the path, every sign, every landmark, but I was so terrified that I could barely concentrate. The rain had increased, making visibility even more difficult. All I could think about was my family, my wife Janet and my 2 children in Nashville, who I might never see again. Suddenly, he ordered me to turn onto a dirt road that was almost invisible in the darkness. It was a narrow and bumpy path, difficult to maneuver with a truck that size. The mud from the rain made the tires slide dangerously. After about 10 minutes of that terror, we arrived in a kind of open area which looked like an old abandoned farm. There was a dilapidated building in the distance and several rusty vehicles scattered across the land. The man ordered me to stop the truck there. My legs were so wobbly that I thought I wouldn't even be able to use the pedals properly. When I finally stopped, he told me to turn off all the lights and be completely silent. The only sound was the rain hitting the cabin roof and my uncontrolled breathing. We stayed like that for several minutes, as if he was waiting for something. The silence was deafening, and the total darkness outside only increased my despair. It was then that we started to hear the sounds of approaching engines. First one, then another and another. Headlights started to illuminate the area, and I could see for the first time where we actually were. It was some kind of junkyard or car graveyard in the middle of nowhere. Several vehicles began to appear and form a circle around my truck. Old pickups, unmarked vans, cars that looked like they came out of a horror movie. I counted at least 6 different vehicles. People began to emerge from them, all dressed in black, moving like shadows in the darkness. My heart was beating so hard I thought it was going to explode. The man behind me remained silent, but I could feel that he was tense, as if he was also nervous about the situation. The people outside didn't make any noise, they just moved in a synchronized manner, as if they were following some kind of macabre ritual. At that moment, something even stranger began to happen. Out of nowhere, all the vehicle headlights went out at the same time, plunging everything into deep darkness. The man behind me swore under his breath and began to get agitated. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured, more to himself than to me. The pressure of the knife on the back of my neck eased a little. Outside, he could see figures moving in the darkness, but now they seemed different, taller, more strange. A greenish light, which was not coming from anywhere, began to dimly illuminate the area. The smell of burning invaded the cabin. I heard muffled screams outside and the sounds of running. The people dressed in black were now running in all directions, as if they were running away from something. The man behind me started to shake. "Shit, shit, shit," he repeated over and over. Then something happened that I will never forget. A very strong light, like a giant spotlight, illuminated the entire place from top to bottom. It was so intense that I was momentarily blinded. When I managed to open my eyes again, the man behind me was gone. Simply gone. I didn't hear the door opening. I didn't feel any movement. It just evaporated. The knife he was holding was lying on the floor of the cabin. Outside, chaos was total. People ran and screamed. Some fell to the ground as if they had been hit by something invisible. The cars began to spontaneously catch fire, one by one, with green flames that appeared alive. The air was charged with static electricity, making my hair stand on end. My whole body tingled, as if I were receiving small shocks. In complete panic, I turned the key in the ignition. The truck's engine choked twice before starting. I engaged first gear and stepped on the accelerator, not caring about anything in the way. I drove like crazy down that dirt road, skidding in the mud, almost flipping over several times. In the rearview mirror, I saw the green light rising into the sky like a giant pillar, and then total darkness. I have no idea how I found my way back to the main road. I drove nonstop for hours, completely in shock, until I arrived at a police station in Virginia. I told the police everything, who sent vehicles to the scene, but obviously they found nothing. No burned cars, no signs of people, no marks in the ground. The knife that had been left in the cabin also disappeared at some point during the escape. It was as if nothing had happened. Today, 3 months later, I'm still trying to understand what happened that night. I no longer use that route. In fact, I avoid driving at night whenever I can. I installed cameras in the truck's cabin and a bright light that I always keep on. Other drivers think I was paranoid, and maybe I was. I searched the internet for similar cases and found some similar reports from truck drivers in the same region, but nothing conclusive. The man who hid in my cabin was never identified, and I sometimes wonder if he was also a victim of something bigger, considering his behavior at the end. The police closed the case due to lack of evidence, but I know what I saw was real. Those green lights, the cars on fire, the people running, it all happened. And the worst thing is knowing that, whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere on the dark roads of the United States. Hey guys, I never thought I'd share this here, but after 15 years on the road as a truck driver, what happened that night in October 2023 still haunts me. My name is Mike Sullivan. I'm 47 years old and I've been commuting between Chicago and Portland for over a decade. It was a particularly cold night, and I was crossing that stretch of Highway 12 in Idaho that runs through the Clearwater National Forest. It was after 11 p.m., and except for the headlights of my red Peterbilt 389, affectionately nicknamed Big Red, the darkness was absolute. The radio hissed more than usual in that region, so I turned it off, leaving only the sound of the engine to keep me company while I chewed some already hard beef jerky from the gas station where I stopped a few hours ago. That's when I saw something that made me hit the brakes almost instinctively. About 200 meters ahead, the headlights of a car illuminated the side of the road like two bright eyes cutting through the fog that was beginning to form. As I got closer, I slowed down and could see that it was a black, late-model Ford Explorer, parked on the side of the road with the driver's door wide open. What intrigued me most was that other than the headlights being on, the car seemed perfectly fine. No signs of an accident or apparent mechanical problems. In that wilderness, with the next town at least 40 miles away, something didn't smell right. 15 years on the road teaches you to trust your instincts, but it also gives you a guilty conscience when you ignore someone who may need help. I parked the truck about 30 meters in front of the Explorer, leaving the engine running and the emergency lights flashing. I grabbed my Maglite flashlight, those big metal ones that also serve as a baton if necessary, and my cell phone. No signal as expected. That stretch of Highway 12 is known for being a communication dead spot. The air was thick and cold, and each breath formed a small cloud in front of me. The sound of the crickets and the wind in the trees were so loud it made my ears ring, as if the forest were alive and watching my every move. I walked towards the abandoned car, keeping a safe distance and lighting my surroundings. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called out a few times, but only the echo of my own voice responded. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The driver's seat was reclined all the way back, and there was an open document folder on the passenger seat. with papers scattered around as if someone had left in a hurry. On the center console, a Starbucks coffee was still slightly smoking. Whoever was driving had left just a few minutes ago. The most disturbing thing was a strong smell of sweet perfume mixed with something I couldn't identify at the time, but it made my stomach turn. That's when I heard the first crack of branches breaking, coming from the forest to the right of the road. I pointed the flashlight in that direction, but the darkness between the trees seemed to swallow the light. "Hey, is there anyone out there who needs help?" I shouted again. The silence that followed was different. The crickets had stopped, and even the wind seemed to have calmed down. It was the kind of silence that makes your hair stand on end, as if all of nature was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a whisper, so low that I initially thought it was just the wind, but there was something wrong with it. It was as if several voices were speaking at the same time, some high-pitched, others low-pitched, in a language I couldn't understand. At that moment, I noticed that there were footprints in the mud next to the car, several of them, intersecting as if several people had walked in circles there. But they weren't normal footprints. Some looked human, but others were different, larger, and with a shape I had never seen before. And they were all recent. The mud was still damp around the edges. My heart started to beat faster when I noticed that some of the footprints were heading towards my truck. It was then that I heard another noise, this time coming from the opposite side of the road, as if something heavy was moving through the trees, circling slowly around where I was standing. My instinct was screaming at me to run back to the truck, but something kept me frozen there. The sound of movement was now coming from all directions, as if I were being surrounded. The light from my flashlight began to fail, flickering frantically, and the sweet smell I had smelled before grew stronger, now mixed with an odor of wet earth and something reminiscent of blood. In the back seat of the Explorer, something caught my attention. There was a children's backpack, pink with sequins, but it was covered in a dark, viscous substance that ran down the leather of the seat. When I leaned in to take a closer look, my flashlight finally revealed something that made me take 2 steps back. There were deep scratch marks on the roof of the car, as if something with huge claws had tried to open the vehicle from above. The whispers increased in volume, and now I could clearly make out that it wasn't just one person speaking. It was as if there was an invisible crowd around me, their voices blending together in a disturbing way. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Between the whispers, I began to hear something that sounded like childish laughter, but distorted, as if it were being played backwards. My flashlight blinked one last time and went out completely, leaving me with only the light from the Explorer's headlights and my distant truck. That's when I saw, through the reflection in the car window, something moving quickly behind me that I turned so fast I almost fell, and for a split second, I swear I saw a figure too tall and thin to be human hide behind a tree. I couldn't make out details, but the way it moved, it was as if its limbs were too long, bent at impossible angles. At that moment, the Explorer's lights began to blink, and the car's radio turned on by itself, alternating between static and fragments of what sounded like music from a music box. The childish sound made my blood run cold, mainly because I recognized the melody. It was "Pop Goes the Weasel," but played at the wrong, slower rhythm, as if the box's string was running out. Finally, my body decided to obey the survival instinct, and I began to retreat towards my truck, without taking my eyes off the darkness around me. With every step I took, I heard corresponding footsteps coming from the forest, as if several things were moving along with me, maintaining the same distance. The whispers started to get louder and clearer. Now I could make out some English words mixed with what sounded like Latin or some ancient language. "Join us, driver," and "Stay, stay, stay" were repeated over and over, in voices that ranged from childlike whispers to growls that could not have been produced by human vocal cords. I had about 15 meters left to get to the truck when its emergency lights started flashing faster, erratically, and the engine, which I had left running, started to fail. Panic completely gripped me as I realized that the shadows between my truck and me seemed to be moving, condensing, as if the darkness itself was taking shape. The sweet smell was unbearable now, and I began to feel a strong dizziness, as if the air was too heavy to breathe. That's when I saw, illuminated by the flashing headlights, a small pale hand, with extra long fingers and dark, pointy fingernails, emerging from behind my truck, followed by another and another, all moving unnaturally, like spiders climbing a wall. The voices were now screaming in my head, a deafening form of pleas, threats, and distorted laughter. My legs were shaking so much that I could barely stand. A few meters away from me, I clearly saw a figure emerge from the forest. It was like a person, but all wrong. It was easily 8 feet tall, with limbs as thin and elongated as tree branches, and where the face should have been there was just a dark mass that seemed to constantly twitch. The thing tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if studying me, and began moving toward me with uncoordinated movements, like a puppet being controlled by a drunken puppeteer. At that moment, something inside me snapped. Perhaps it was the most primal survival instinct, or perhaps I had simply lost my mind, but I began to run. Not in the coordinated way like in the movies, stumbling, staggering, practically dragging myself towards the cab of my truck. Behind me, I heard what sounded like a crowd running, dozens of feet stamping on the asphalt, and that horrible sound I'll never forget, a mix of childish laughter and a high-pitched screech, like fingernails scratching a chalkboard. The air became so thick that it felt like I was running underwater, and every movement required superhuman effort. I managed to get to the truck door, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the handle. When I finally opened it, something grabbed my ankle. It was cold and rough, like tree bark, but it moved like fingers. I kicked with all the strength I could muster and heard a sharp sound of pain that didn't sound human at all. I threw myself into the cabin and slammed the door so hard that the glass shook. The truck's engine was dying, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw dozens of dark shapes moving around the vehicle, some crawling along the sides, others so tall that their heads reached the cab windows. On the windshield, those pale, elongated hands began to appear, leaving dark marks on the glass as they crawled across the surface. I turned the key desperately, begging the engine to start. "Come on, please," I shouted, as the creatures started to rock the truck. The sound of whispers was now inside the cabin, as if they were speaking directly into my ears. One of the taller creatures leaned over the windshield, and for the first time I saw its face up close. It was like a mask made of shadows that constantly changed, forming expressions of pain and agony. My entire body was shaking. The engine kept failing, making that horrible choking sound, while the creatures seemed increasingly frantic in their attempts to gain entry. Suddenly, all the creatures stopped at once, as if they had heard something I couldn't hear. The one on the windshield turned its misshapen head to the side, as if it was listening to something in the distance. That's when I heard it, the distant sound of another truck approaching. The creatures began to move erratically, some running back into the forest, others dissolving into the shadows like smoke. My truck's engine suddenly started with a roar, as if it had never had a problem before. When the headlights of the other truck appeared around the bend in the road, there was no longer any sign of the creatures, just those dark marks on the glass and the smell that still hung in the air. I passed right by the other speeding truck, barely registering the driver's confused look. I drove non-stop to the next gas station, about 50 miles away, my heart still beating as if it wanted to come out of my chest. When I finally stopped, my legs were so wobbly that I could barely get out of the cabin. In the bathroom at the station, I vomited everything I had in my stomach. It was only when I was washing my face that I noticed there were dark marks around my ankle, right where that thing had grabbed me. They looked like old burns, but they formed a strange pattern, like symbols I had never seen before. The next day, when the police went to check the location, they did not find the explorer or any sign that anything had happened there. The only thing they found was the child's backpack, thrown in the middle of the road, completely clean and with no sign of the slimy substance I had seen. Inside was just a crayon drawing, a series of tall, dark figures surrounding what appeared to be a red truck. That was 4 months ago, and since then I have refused to take that route at night. The marks on my ankle are still there, and sometimes, when it's really quiet, I swear I hear those whispers and the distorted melody of "Pop Goes the Weasel." I never found out what happened to the driver of the Explorer or the kid in the backpack, and honestly, I don't know if I want to find out.